Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 384. In this bonus episode of Do Not Be Hasty, we'll be talking about hobbits, and specifically the history and culture of hobbits. We'll do so by exploring the first part of the prologue to The Lord of the Rings concerning hobbits. However, before we begin, we'd like to give a double up bear five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up, fellowship. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Very nice. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, John R, KG, SaberSystems, and Jeremy D. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in July of 2024, Carolyn S, Spencer M, Seb M, Matthew W, Werty, David B, and Chris L. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. So in this episode of Do Not Be Hasty, as I mentioned before, we'll begin a multi-episode journey through the prologue of The Lord of the Rings. I expect it to take 3 episodes. The prologue of The Lord of the Rings is broken into 5 parts: concerning hobbits, concerning pipeweed, of the ordering of the Shire, of the finding of the ring, and a note on the Shire records. We'll be considering the first section concerning hobbits in this episode. In this section, we'll get a high-level overview of the history of hobbits, going all the way back to their origins. In the coming episodes, we'll deal with the other sections of the prologue. All right, let's dive into Concerning Hobbits. I'll kick things off by reading the first paragraph from Concerning Hobbits. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of Westmarch that has already been published under the title of The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earliest chapters of the Red Book, composed by Willbo himself, the first hobbit to become famous in the world at large, and called by him there and back again, since they told of his journey into the East and his return, an adventure which later involved all the hobbits and the great events of that age that are here related. So, one thing I want to highlight here is just that Tolkien is still kind of playing with this idea of that he is the writer or composer of this story, is really a compiler in universe, right? He's discovered this Red Book of Westmarch. It's come down to him, and he's trying to give it a, kind of a wider awareness, if you will. And as part of this, he says that, hey, that first book I wrote, that was actually from this Red Book of Westmarch. We'll talk more about the Red Book of Westmarch a little later in this little short series on the prologue. It actually a good bit about it in the sections that follow. But just interesting to kind of highlight that idea that Tolkien is still playing with this, I don't know what you want to call it, like a trope or something like that, that this is something that he has discovered and he wants to give a wider exposure to this ancient history of the hobbits and their involvement in the greater history of Middle-earth. Well, as we move on to Chapter 2, what I'll highlight is that hobbits love peace and quiet. It says hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people. They love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. They have general disdain for more than relatively simple machinery. They are shy of the big folk, really good at disappearing. And they don't study magic, even though they can seem at times magical. All right, so it's like their ability to just kind of disappear whenever big folk are around. It makes them seem somewhat magical. But what I want to highlight here is this theme of machinery and magic, right? So they have a general disdain for complex machinery. And though others might consider them magical, they don't consider themselves magical, right? They aren't really magical. Now, these ideas of machinery and magic are very important in Tolkienian, and kind of the Tolkienian mindset, the Tolkienian themes. Elsewhere in the Waldman letter, as I've discussed many times before, Tolkien talks about magic and machine being kind of like things that figures like Sauron engage in, right? They create these machines, which Tolkien really views as sort of the modern notion of what the ancients would have called magic. They create these things in order to make their will more quickly effective, right? This is opposed to sort of the elvish approach to creation, right? To kind of working with the natural world. The machinery and the magic, they seek to dominate the natural world. Just an interesting little note. It's always something to keep in mind. Really helps to understand where Tolkien was coming from with all of his stories, in my view. All right, so let's that was actually kind of a part of paragraph 3, so a slight correction there, if you will. Well, let's move on to paragraph 4. So, Hobbit stature. What are hobbits like? As we all know, hobbits are small, much smaller than like elves, men, even dwarves. It says right, they're smaller than dwarves. They are usually of a height of between 2 and 4 feet and an average of 3 feet. They were a little bit taller in ancient days, and kind of the super tall hobbits, if you will. Of them, Tolkien mentions Bandubras Bullroarer Took, who was 5 foot 4 inches and could ride a horse. Right, so almost 4.5 feet tall and could ride a horse. Still very small in human terms, but this was one of the larger hobbits. So 4 feet was really like, wow, you're a pretty tall hobbit if you're 4 feet tall. So if you kind of consider like the average height of a man in our days, I believe is around right around 5'10", right? That kind of 5'8" to 6 foot window is kind of like the average height for your average man. I think women are usually like 5'3" to 5'7". Hobbits are, the average height for a hobbit is roughly half that, maybe a little bit over the half of that. So, a hobbit, if you had met one in real life, is coming up to about your waist, right? That's where they're going to be. All right, paragraph 5. Hobbits of the Shire were a merry folk. They were dressed in bright colors. They often dressed in bright colors, especially yellow and green. They seldom wore shoes and had hardy feet. I think we all kind of get that sense. So the Proudfoot clan must have been had especially hardy feet if they were very proud of their feet. Their faces, the faces of hobbits were good-natured. They ate and drank a lot, and they were very hospitable and loved parties. So I don't think any of this is too surprising to those of us who have some familiarity with the stories, even kind of a passing familiarity. I think that's kind of the general picture of hobbits in popular culture these days because of the Peter Jackson movies. Obviously, one thing I want to note is that opening sequence, that wonderful kind of opening sequence in the Fellowship of the Ring and Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring is largely based on this section of the prologue. In fact, the tune, if you will, the kind of theme that goes on during this section of the film, of course, when who is it that's narrating it? I'm trying to think. Is it Bilbo or is it? I believe it's Bilbo who's narrating it. I could be wrong. Memory fails me. I didn't think to look this up. I believe it's Bilbo who's narrating it, which is fitting because it's a section from it's kind of coming from the Red Book of Westmarch. But the theme that's going on is kind of these little light and humorous like little vignettes of the various hobbits in the Shire. The theme that's going on is actually called Concerning Hobbits. It's that really beautiful sort of simple theme that's based in. It's actually based in the tune of an old hymn. This is my father's world. So just worth noting there that tune is called Concerning Hobbits, and that section is kind of based on this section of the Lord of the Rings. All right. Hobbits, it says in paragraph 6, are relatives of men. They are related to men, though their exact relationship can no longer be discovered. It says their beginning lies back in the elder days. So what are the Elder Days? For those of us who maybe aren't as familiar with the broader legendarium, the Elder Days really have to do with the period of the first age of Middle Earth. And maybe even before that, right? So it's not a like super technically defined term, but you can kind of think of it as roughly that period of time before the Second Age. So even before Numenor, when men were just kind of starting to make their presence known. In the world, they were starting to become known to the elves of Beleriand, and so the Elder Days are thought to kind of end with the time of Morgoth, right? So the end of the end of Morgoth's reign, right? The downfall of Morgoth at the end of the First Age. Just to be sure, I did look this up in this particular passage up in Hammond and Skull's Reader Companion, and they agree that this is before that the period of the Elder Days is the period before the downfall of Morgoth. It says that most other races were ignorant of them for many long years. They seemed of very little importance to the wise and the great. That's a very important thing to note. The hobbits have been around for a long time. Their beginning does lie back in the Elder Days, and they do seem of very little importance to the wise and the great. I wanna pause here, and this is an interesting thing for me to note because one of the things that I kind of have scratched my head with regard to the Rings of Power, the Amazon TV show, they have these hobbitish figures who are part of the show, of course. The question was, would they have even existed in the Second Age of Middle Earth at any point? I don't know that I ever took great issue with this. I might have. If I'm eating my words, I'm fine with that. I'm always happy to if I'm proven wrong by what Tolkien said. But it does seem that, per the prologue here, some species like hobbits even existed as far back as the Elder Days. So it's just that they weren't really well known to the wise and the great for much of this period of time. And that's not necessarily a commentary on other interactions with them, but it is interesting to note at least that that there does seem to have been precedent in Tolkien's writing for them to have existed during the Second Age, some kind of hobbitish figures to have existed during the Second Age. All right, moving on to paragraph 7. So let me make sure I've got the right passage pulled up here. So, all right, here we are. Those days, the Third Age of Middle Earth, are now long past. We're looking at the history of Hobbit locales. It says they still linger. They still linger, and it would seem Tolkien is saying, like, kind of in our day. He seems to be contending that hobbits still exist in some form. Again, this is kind of a fun thing I think that he played with in The Hobbit and There and Back Again, the original Bilbo story. It says they lived in the northwest of the old world, east of the sea. So, Tolkien is really kind of locating them in this northern European region. He says a minority were studied, and their own records began only after the settling of the Shire, which we'll find takes place in the middle of the Third Age. Their earliest tales put their origin in the upper vales of the Anduin. Let's take a quick look at what that means. So let's take a quick look at our map of Middle Earth. Maybe zoom in just a bit here so we can get a nice picture. So if I'm looking at the upper vales of the Anduin, I would locate that really sort of, in this region here, right? So the Anduin River, you can kind of follow it here, plays a big part in later part of the Fellowship of the Ring and in other parts of the Lord of the Rings. And this would be the region. Remember, as we've learned, as well, actually, did we discuss? Yeah, we discussed this when we talked about the forward, and we're going to discuss it. Actually, you will have heard the episode 383 on Smeagol and Daigle, where we talk some about their location. By the time you hear this one, so Smeagol and Daigle, the whole episode with them takes place here in the region of the Gladden River where it joins the Anduin. So it makes sense that these ancestors of the hobbits would have first dwelt in the region, the upper vales of the Anduin here. So that's kind of the location that we're talking about. Why did they migrate to Eriador? Well, we don't really know exactly. Tolkien says towards the end of the paragraph that their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land and a shadow that fell in the forest so that it became darkened and its new name was Mirkwood. Of course, we're talking about kind of the early part of the Third Age, early to middle part of the Third Age when this started happening. So this is, of course, the time that Sauron is starting to make his presence known again. And men are multiplying, throughout that particular region of the world. All right. One thinks also maybe, of course, Tolkien doesn't mention this, but maybe they would have been a little bit intimidated by maybe a Beorn type figure and living in this area. So who knows? Maybe there were more than just that one Beorn type figure. I hadn't really thought about that too much, but it's at least interesting to speculate. All right. Paragraph 8 deals with the 3 different breeds of the hobbits, and these are the Harfoots, the Stoors, and the Fallowhides. We learned that the Harfoots were brown-skinned, smaller, shorter, beardless, and bootless. They preferred highlands and hillsides. I believe this is the name of the Hobbit group in the Rings of Power. The Harfoots, so that's kind of seems to fit with what we see of their depiction there. Then we have the Stores, who were broader, heavier, larger feet and hands. They preferred flatlands and riversides. And then we have Fallowhides, who were fairer skinned, taller, and slimmer. They were lovers of trees and of woodlands. So paragraphs 9, 10, and 11 go a little bit more into detail on these three groups. The Harfoots, they had much to do with dwarves in ancient times. Again, I suspect that this will tie into Rings of Power at some point, that perhaps this group of Harfoots will come into contact with the dwarves who are in the show. But kind of moving on from there, the Harfoots were most normal and representative of hobbits and the most numerous. And they longest preserved the ancient and the ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. The Stores, of course, we know, I mentioned already Daigle and Smeagol, they were Stores. It says later on in the chapter The Shadow of the Past, it says that they were Stores. They were less shy of men, and they came west after the Harfoots and dwelt between Tarbod and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. So when they came west, they dwelled in, let me clear things here. Actually, we can keep that as it is. They came west after the Harfoots, dwelt between Tharbad and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. So Dunland being right here, Tharbad being right here. Let me circle Dunland here. So this is kind of getting down into the region of Isengard. So we might call it like kind of this Inidwaith up near the Glanduin, and even up close to where Holland once was in the Moria Gate in this region. So that was where the Stores first were, and then they eventually migrated north into the region of the Shire. All right, and then the Fallowhides, we learn, were the least numerous of all of these predecessors of the Hobbits. They came over the mountains into Ariador north of Rivendell and came down the river Horwell. So again, going back to our map, if we look at this, so this is the Horwell right here. And so that means they came over and kind of came down into the area this way. So Fallowhides this way. We got the Stores coming this way. Right, Stores. And then I'm not sure it's specified. I didn't note it if it did where the Harfoots came in. Let's see. The Harfoots had much to do with dwarves. They moved westward early and roamed over Ariador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in Wilderland. Okay, so they came over probably, kind of in this close to this region of Rivendell, and came through this way. So Fallowhides to the north, Harfoots kind of the central region, and then the Stores to the south. The Fallowhides were friendlier with the elves and more learned than the other groups of Hobbit predecessors. They were often found as leaders and chieftains amongst Harfoots and Stores. So they were kind of taller, slimmer. They loved trees and woodlands, and they were maybe just a little more learned, right? So for that reason, they seem to have kind of risen to being leaders of the Hobbits, as these three groups kind of converged into one group of Hobbits later on in their history. And we actually find this with the fact that the Fallowhides were often ancestors of the Tooks and the Brandybucks, right? So the Tooks and the Brandybucks being kind of two examples of sort of ruling families within the Shire. Now, we hear things like ruling families, and we tend to read like these kinds of things with a lot of suspicion. But we'll find that the Hobbits weren't necessarily like men in the way of like being very more akin to like dominating other men. But they were a little more. There seems to be a little bit more of a, I don't know, for lack of a better term, kind of a common good orientation with the Hobbits, right? I think the Hobbits kind of knew, like, wait a minute, we are the small people in this big world, in this world of big people. Maybe it's best that we band together, have each other's backs, and, we don't try to dominate each other, but instead we worry about kind of watching out for ourselves. And I think that's really a better way of looking at how Hobbit culture was oriented, right? It wasn't so much about, the Fallowhides, the stronger, maybe smarter Hobbits dominating the less smart Hobbits, but it was more about like, hey, natural gifts of certain groups let's band together and use all of our gifts for the good of all, right? Which I don't know. That sounds to me like a better arrangement than how we usually do it as mankind, unfortunately. All right. Paragraph 12, it talks about their settling in the Eriador Westlands. So we're starting to get into how they came to be in the Shire, really. So in Eriador, hobbits eventually found a home as the remnants of Arnor declined. Bree is one of the last surviving settlements from that era, though reduced in size. So just so that's clear, let me kind of clear off all of this. So this is the lost realm of Arnor. And if you'll recall, Arnor was the northern kingdom of the remnant of Numenor, right? So when Numenor fell, you had Arnor was the northern kingdom and Gondor being the southern kingdom. Over the course of the Third Age, Arnor, even though it starts most powerful, it starts to decline. And by the time the hobbits arrive in the region of Bree, of the Midlands and Westlands of Eriador, Arnor is very much on the decline, though it still exists. It's in a very kind of fragmented way. It still has some power and some sway over the affairs of the region. It says, as hobbits mingled, in paragraph 13, it says, as hobbits mingled with the remnants of the Dunedain, they forgot their old languages and began to adopt the common speech. So hobbits had their own languages at one point, but because of the influence from the Dunedain of Arnor, they adopt the common speech that came from Numenor. They kept a few words of their own as well as many names, which is why we do get certain words. I think MATHOMS being an example of like an original Hobbit word, and then a lot of names that sound very Hobbitish and you wouldn't necessarily find amongst men. All right, paragraphs 14 and 15. Let me make sure I've got my right place here. All right. So in Third Age 1601, Marcho and Blanco Fallowhide, who were brothers, with permission of the High King at Fornost, crossed the Branduin with a great following of hobbits and settled what is now known as the Shire. So let's just, again, look at where Fornost is. So Fornost being right here in the center region of Arnor here, maybe south central Arnor. There's a lot more to be said about Arnor. It's a very interesting sort of history there. But you can see with respect to the Shire, it's maybe just on what we now think of as the northern border of the Shire. We can see that the hobbits had somewhat of a close proximity to the capital of Arnor at this time. So they come over the Branduin River, Bree being here, right? And then the Branduin, the Brandywine, being here. So they come over into this region. And they did it with the permission of the King of Fornost, and they came with a lot of other hobbits. And they settled what is now known as the Shire. The only demands from the king, as it turned out, it says, all that was demanded of them was that they should keep the Great Bridge in repair, being the bridge over the Brandywine, and all other bridges and roads, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. So for them, it sounds like a pretty good arrangement, right? They really just had kind of a logistical purpose in that area, and he was like, as far as like settling the area and making it your own, have at it. Interesting arrangement and a very profitable arrangement for the hobbits for sure. But this year, Third Age 1601 is, if you'll remember, the first year of the Shire Reckoning. This is where the Shire really begins. Officially begins, if you will. The Third Age 1601, and so if you remember, all you have to do to convert Third Age years to Shire Reckoning years is subtract 1600 years, right? So the year 3001, which is when the Fellowship of the Ring begins with Bilbo's birthday party, you subtract that and you get the year, subtract 1600 from that, you get 1401, right? So Shire Reckoning 1401. The Shire becomes the Hobbit homeland, essentially. The Hobbits loved it, remained there, and passed out of the history of elves and men for the next several centuries, really. They still remained subjects of the Northern Kings, but they were ruled by their own chieftains and had little taste for outside events. So even as the King of Fornost really is like, hey, here's this land, I'm your king. He didn't really seem terribly concerned, right? Again, the great and the wise are not terribly concerned about these little people, these strange little people, right? Who live these simple lives. Just hang on to that theme because it's so important in Tolkien's mindset when it comes to the story of the hobbits and this very hobbit focused storytelling in the Lord of the Rings. They did send bowmen to the Battle of Fornost in Third Age 1975. So as time goes on, Fornost and the region of Arnor continues to decline. The hobbits do contribute somewhat militarily during this period. They were very good bowmen, apparently. But after that, really, Fornost and the northern line of the kings kind of ceases to have any sway over the affairs of, great sway over the affairs of Eriador. Of course, this all ties into the story of Aragorn, which we won't get into in this series of episodes, but we will, of course, get into at some point in Do Not Be Hasty, the Greater Arc, as Aragorn comes into the picture. After the end of the Northern Kings, the Hobbits of the Shire elected a Thane to hold the authority of the Northern King. So they elected this Thane not to replace the king, but to hold his authority for the region of the Shire. So that's where the term the Thane comes from. Paragraph 16 deals with the size of the Shire, and I thought this was interesting. I did the math. I kind of went on Google Maps and tried to figure out some different countries, like modern countries that might be roughly the same size as the Shire. I was kind of surprised by the size of the Shire, actually. It says it's 40 leagues from west to east, a league being approximately 3.5 miles. So 140 miles from west to east and 50 leagues from north to south, which means 175 miles from north to south. So 140 by 175 are the dimensions, roughly speaking, of the Shire. So I put this as roughly the size of the middle section of England, kind of that part where you have Wales, and then just north of that. So you kind of, if you put the line at kind of the where the Isle of Britain kind of juts out, and you have Wales there. If you put it right there and just draw a line east to west, that's roughly the size of the west to east portions, and then you can kind of imagine a line. But maybe a better example would be a mid-sized European nation such as Belgium, the Netherlands, Ireland, or Switzerland, right? One of those four nations somewhat approximates the size of the Shire. So, those aren't terribly large nations in comparison to others, but it gives you an idea of the size of the Shire, and they aren't tiny either, right? It gives you a pretty, I think, good idea of the size of the Shire, that it's not maybe as small a place as we tend to think about it. Of course, much of the action that we experience is concentrated in a small region of the Shire, but still, it would take you take somebody, I assume, several days to walk across one of those countries, unless they were a marathon runner, perhaps running. But that's the size. That's roughly the size of the Shire: Belgium, the Netherlands, Ireland, Switzerland, kind of the middle section of the Isle of Britain there. And it says over time, the hobbits of the Shire became sheltered, right? Nobody really cared too much about them, right? It was just, if you did, interact with them, it's because you were passing through that region of Eriador. Paragraph 17 says, they really weren't warlike. Hobbits really are not warlike. Their last battle with significant Hobbit presence was the Battle of Greenfields in the Shire Reckoning 1147, so the Third Age 2747, in which the aforementioned Bandobrus Bullroar routed an invasion of orcs. It mentions Mathom houses, of course, refer to our first Mathoms episode to understand what Mathoms actually means. But it says that oftentimes their weapons were kept in Mathoms houses as decorations. Paragraph 18 says that hobbits are difficult to daunt or kill. They had ease and peace had left them curiously tough. For sport, they killed nothing that lived, and they were slow to quarrel and shot well with the bow, as we already mentioned. Paragraphs 19 and 20 talk about hobbit dwellings. We tend to think of hobbits dwelling in holes. They've been hole dwellers, not hell dwellers, hole dwellers in times past. In Bilbo's time, only the richest and poorest hobbits still lived in holes, and above-ground houses became more common in many parts of the Shire. So holes were really things like, if you were rich like Bilbo, you could afford a large and luxurious hobbit hole, as he had, as Baggins was. If you were poor, you could, that was the only thing you could afford, so you just dug out a hole and probably had no windows and was not very nice to live in, but that was your place. And then, kind of the middle class of hobbits lived in more above-ground houses, as time went on. It does mention somewhat about that they were not really, they didn't really build towers like the elves did. They learned the craft of building probably both from the Dunedain and the elves, so they could build their houses, but their houses tended to remain very low to the ground. They knew the elf towers to the west, but had little interest in them and generally feared the sea. They did not really go in for towers at all, it says. They preferred long, low houses, so they were a single-story house kind of people, if you get what I mean. Round doors and windows were a Hobbit architectural tradition. So that is one thing that seems to have come from Hobbit specifically, is the idea of the round door. Maybe that's just a leftover from the whole concept of the Hobbit hole, right? As a distinctive mark of their architecture. So that's a neat little note. And then finally, we come to the last couple of paragraphs of this section. Houses and holes of hobbits were often large and inhabited by large families. And it says hobbits were clannish. I think we kind of get this sense, but Tolkien says it out right here. They drew long and elaborate family trees. They were very kind of obsessed with family lineages and that kind of thing. He says that all but hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. And this is, I think, is partly Tolkien just kind of acknowledging his own hobbitishness and hobbitishness. A lot of words I'm having trouble saying this morning. Hobbitishness. Tolkien is acknowledging that aspect of himself when he writes this in kind of a winking manner, because of course he drew out all the family trees for the different groups of hobbits. So, the more you get into this stuff, the more interesting it becomes. You understand why Tolkien put it in. But it's like for even for those of us who are like, know the stories pretty well, you often think of these things and you're like, why would these be interesting to anybody? But it's only when you kind of truly adopt the mindset of a hobbit that you really get into this stuff. So there you go. I guess I'm finally achieving that mark, is starting to adopt the mindset of a hobbit, which I look at as a life achievement. I hope you do too. All right. Well, there's so much packed into this section, of course. I'm sure there's certain notes I skipped over, maybe a few details I didn't quite get accurate. Hey, we'll do a MATHOMS episode on the prologue and of course the foreword, which you've already heard as well, probably at some point as well. So, hey, send in the mail and the correspondence, the comments and all of that for these episodes as well, and we'll get around to discussing them. Doing a mailbag episode, and I should say, I don't know if we'll do a MATHOMS episode. This feels a little bit like doing this forward and prologue series feels a little bit like its own kind of MATHOMS series, if you will, because we kind of started off right into the story instead of dealing with these front matters themselves. But maybe over time this becomes, with the appendices that we'll get to probably many years from now, this will become its own sort of season of the series, if you will, with the matters that aren't exactly part of the text of the story, the actual story. All right. As Gandalf said, hobbits really are amazing creatures. Concerning hobbits shows us just how much care and thought Tolkien put into these humble creatures. It confirms Tolkien's view that hobbits represent the easily forgotten and common folk of the world, that in special moments are raised up to play a major part in world events. In the next episode, we'll continue through the prologue as we consider the sections concerning pipeweed and of the ordering of the Shire. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider supporting us in one or all of the following ways. First, join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/Tolkien Road. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and lend you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/Tolkien Road. Second, if you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. As always, keep the correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. With Do Not Be Hasty, we'll let the mail pile up and then do a big mailbag episode at the end of each chapter. While we can't promise you that your mail will be read on air, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, so drop those comments and send those emails. Finally, don't forget to stop by TrueMistPress.com for great merch like super styling and comfy Tolkien Road t-shirts, Two Trees camper mugs, and signed copies of my books, Tolkien's Requiem and Tolkien's Overture. Once again, that's TrueMistPress.com. Thanks for supporting our work with your purchase. To close, as always, I'd like to thank our amazing fellowship. I know all of you half as well as I should like, and I've thanked less than half of you half as well as you deserve. Special thanks to the following: John R, Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, KG, Melkor27, SaberSystems, Jeremy D, Emilio P, Jonathan D, Richard K, Paul D, Julia, Werty, Chris B, 2or91, Carolyn S, Emiel K, Brian O II, Jonathan R, Matthew W, Daniel D, Harrison C, Jason C, Seb M, Willbo Baggins, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O I, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Asya V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, and Eric B. Finally, thanks to all for watching and or listening. Until next time, the road goes ever on. Bye-bye, everybody.